In the Book of Mormon, the Nephites were described as following the law of Moses until the coming of Christ. So in 3rd Nephi chapter 9, when Jesus Christ visits the Nephites, Christ tells them to no longer practice the sacrifices under the law of Moses, no more burnt offerings. That's in 3rd Nephi chapter 9, verse 19. So one of the interesting questions is whether there's evidence in the Americas of any of the Native Americans following the law of Moses. In previous videos, I've mentioned some other things. For example, in the video about Kishkumen, I mentioned some aspects about the law of Moses that were followed by the Ojibwe. In this particular video, I want to look at some evidence related to the Hopewell, the Native Americans that were in the eastern United States at the time of the Book of Mormon, and some evidence that they followed the law of Moses in terms of burnt sacrifices. Now, sacrifices in the law of Moses would be of animals and would be done on an altar. And there is some evidence of the use of altars by the Hopewell, and I'm going to share some of that information with you. Now, some of this information will come from a book that was actually written by my mother. My mother is Lynette Hadley Reed, and she's written a number of books on things. Some of you may know her in some of her materials related to the Hebrew feast days and how we got the Bible. She also was the one that identified that Joseph Smith received the golden plates on Rosh Hashanah, which some of you may have heard as well. But one of her more recent books was called A Voice to Shake the Earth, that one. And in chapter 7 of it, she talks about some evidence that she found about the Hopewell using sacrificial altars that would be consistent with doing sacrifices under the law of Moses. And then she also identifies some information pointing to the decommissioning of those altars, which could coincide with the time of the coming of Christ. I'm going to go ahead and share some of that information with you. Now, most of the information she got about the Hopewell came from this Squire and Davis book, Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. Squire and Davis were the first main archaeologists to do work on the mound builders, and in particular in the Ohio area, and they excavated mounds and showed information about those mounds. Now, there are a number of types of mounds that were created by the Hopewell. Among those are the geometric earthworks. There's also quite a number of burial mounds. There's some defensive fortifications. But then they also have a chapter on what they call sacrificial altars, altar mounds. And this is pages 143 through 160 of their book. And I don't have a copy of it to put up on the screen for you, but I'll just note a couple of the things that they say in their descriptions. Again, it's pages 143 to 160 in the Squire and Davis book. There are a number of mounds that they excavated and did reports on. Almost all of the sacrificial altar mounds were in the Mound City group, which is in the Chillicothe, Ohio area, which is sort of a central area for the Hopewell. And a number of the mounds in that Mound City group in Chillicothe are buried over altars. And so some of the mounds were essentially where altars were, and then those altars were then cleaned over and covered up. And as they describe it in their work, they describe the altars that they found and some information about them. And I'll go ahead and share my screen to share some of the information about those mounds with you. Okay, so I'm putting up on the screen one of the figures that comes from the Squire and Davis book. This is one of the mounds from the Mound City group, where the mound covers up an altar. And as they dug down through the mound, they sort of did a profile of the mound. And what they found is that there was an altar. And this one apparently had two separate layers. So they had done an altar and then ended up making another altar, a refreshed one on top of it before then covering the altar over, presumably when it was decommissioned. The what it found for this particular one was that the altar was made of a red burnt red clay. So it was this burned red clay that was 4 inches thick. Now, the altars that they found, there were several mounds covering up these kinds of altars, and all of the altars had burn markings, the evidence of the burning, but all of them had been cleaned. They don't really have information on what was burned on the altars for the most part. Now, there's questions that has caused as to, well, were these altars burning animals, like sort of a Law of Moses type sacrifice, or are these more just crematory surfaces used for burning the dead? And there is some evidence that there's several of these mounds that some dead were cremated on these types of surfaces. So there could have been more than one type of purpose for the same kind of structure. But the each of them had these altars. The altars could be either of clay or of stone. They found both types. The one with stone is kind of a sand surface, and then they had these sort of chicken egg shaped hen-sized stones that were carefully laid, so it made a nice solid stone surface for the altar. The clay was a very hard clay, almost cement-like. In fact, the Squire and Davis describe hitting the clay with an axe, and it just bounced back up, sort of like you were hitting a rock. They also describe one of the altars as having some stomped in sand into the clay that made it sort of cement-like. So even though it was a clay, it was like a hard, clean surface that was used. Even though the altars were cleaned, and they don't know for sure what was they were, burned on them, what was burned on them usually, it's pretty clear that they were burning at least some kind of um, animals, and because there was, as they described in the sand, kind of the oily, soaked down stuff of a fatty material that had then burned in. So they were burning something there. Now, all of these altars have since been covered over. Each of the mounds where they were covered over, it was done in a meticulous fashion with layers. This particular one on the screen, they covered over with layers of ashes and then a pure sand and then flat stones and then made a mound there. There are a couple of other types that are found right at the same site. In this particular one, again, you can see there was an altar at the bottom, and then it was filled up again with some ashes, and then apparently this had some bones and earth, and then sand and earth and sand. And then there was a later intrusive skeleton burial on the top of this mound. Here was another one. And again, there was an altar at the bottom and then covered over with sand and then layers of earth and sand to then create the mound over top. Now, when you go to the Mound City site, it's a very large site. It's about the size of 10 football fields. And there's a low lying wall that makes sort of kind of a square shape with rounded edges, sort of like a squared circle or a circled square, rounded square. And there are borrowed pits outside where they seem to have used some dirt for the making of the mounds. These borrowed pits were also clay lined, so they lined them so that they would hold water as well. And then there's a number of mounds on the site, and there are a couple other pictures here you can see of that site. So they're large mounds. Now, the altars that were taken out, for example, the British Museum has one of the altars, and as you can see, this one was made of a burnt clay, and they said, well, it could be an altar or it could have been a cremation type basin. They date again to the Book of Mormon time frame, which fits for all of the Hopewell, and this was one of the ones collected by Squire and Davis. Okay. Now, there has been, as I said, some dispute about whether those altars are really altars. The National Park Service, they note the number of mounds that had these altars in them. They end up taking the position that they think that they were cremation sites and that were used some and then buried over. They don't really have an explanation for why they were buried over. But that's the position that they take now. You can find out a lot more about the Mound City site from this Ancient Ohio Trail. This was the same organization that did the nice information about some of the other Hopewell sites, like the Fort Ancient site. And they call this Mound City area, which is right on the west side of the Scioto River. And this is kind of, like I said, sort of a squared circle. Those are those two pits that we saw that were just at an entrance, and then the various mounds that are on the site. They call it a necropolis. You could kind of view it like an Arlington cemetery or something like that, where for the Hopewell, they had these large earthwork sites that are sort of like large assembly areas, ceremonial sites. Most of those other sites are relatively clean or clear on the inside. They might have a mound or two, but they don't have all of the particular mounds that this particular site in Mound City did. This Mound City site has a number of burial sites, and it seems to have been maybe like an Arlington cemetery kind of thing, where some of the Hopewell leaders may have been buried. There are some really other interesting mounds on the site. For example, there's one of the mounds that has 200 purposefully broken pipes that were put in and then kind of burned on one of these altar type surfaces and then covered over. And so it's interesting about what the potential meaning of that was. Now, when they've done the archaeology on these sites and they try to figure out, okay, well, when were these sites used and covered over? It fits the Book of Mormon time frame well, and the covering over of the sites kind of fits the Book of Mormon as well in terms of when you would stop practicing the law of Moses, because most of the archaeologists seem to agree that they were buried over, covered over within that first 200 some years after the coming of Christ, in that first couple of centuries AD. Okay, so that's sort of the information we have on the sites. Again, it's clear that there were many of the mounds had altars in them. Most of the mounds had sort of buildings in them as well. And so some of these altars were within buildings. And interestingly, also, one of the altars here at Mound City was described as about 50 feet long, which is an incredibly long altar. Well, interestingly, in the Temple of Solomon, it had multiple altars as well for the receiving of burnt sacrifices to be done there. and one of them was noted to be about 48 feet wide. So that's another potential correspondence there. Okay, now why would they bury it over in that strange way? And this may relate to what's called a decommissioning that the Jews would do when they decommissioned a temple site or a sacred site. And so let me go this and I'll show you. Okay. Now, in the Old Testament, around 700 BC, King Hezekiah, who at that time was aware of there was a temple at Jerusalem. That was where the Temple of Solomon was. But there were also other temples that were held that were throughout the land. And now in some of those temples, they had sort of fallen into idolatry. And so King Hezekiah ordered that the altars and temples outside of Jerusalem should be shut down, and that instead all the worship should be at the temple in Jerusalem. Now, when that happened, the archaeologists have since found uh, evidence that when they found some of these sites that were destroyed. Now, the pagan type sites, the ones that had fallen into the grove worship and of Baal and Asherah and so forth, those pagan sites, when they were destroyed, they were desecrated. But interestingly, they found one temple site at the Tel Arad temple site that instead of being destroyed and desecrated, it instead was buried over with great care, indicating a respectful decommissioning of that site. In other words, they recognized that that site was a sacred holy place. And so when they decommissioned that temple outside of Jerusalem, they buried it over in a very respectful way. In particular, there they did it with stones, and there's a citation for that where you can see that information about that. Now, interestingly, there is a recent discovery of what may have been Joshua's altar. And some people call that the Mount Ebal site. And so if you pull up Wikipedia for it, you can see this Mount Ebal site and this thing that may have been the altar used by Joshua referred to in the Old Testament. Now, what was one interesting thing about that site was that that had also been buried over and covered over in this sort of decommissioning type sense. And so here's a little bit of information about the Joshua's altar that was there. And so you can see that this was a 2-meter diameter circular altar. Now, interestingly, this is about the right size for some of the altars that were in the Mound City Hopewell site too. Some of these altars were circular and about 6 feet in diameter, which would fit this, by the way. And anyway, this Joshua's altar site had then been covered over and decommissioned, as it says here. This is in an article in the Land of Promise magazine, that's Wayne May's magazine, that talks about how the temple site was covered in field stones, had been covered to protect it from desecrators. The altar was covered to respectfully decommission it, and it has a name in Hebrew for that, meaning a respectful burial. And so my mother's proposal, and what I think is correct, is that these altar sites that were found in Mound City in the Chillicothe, Ohio area that fit to the right time frame in the Book of Mormon, that would have fit around the time of Christ's coming, when they would have been given the order in 3 Nephi 9, chapter 9, verse 19, to no longer do the burnt offerings or sacrifices, that it would make sense that they would do the same thing here, which would be to do this respectful covering over of those sacred sites to protect it from desecrators. And I think that's what you're finding in Mound City, which is really cool. All right, let me go ahead and stop this screen share there. Okay, so in summary, there is evidence of the following of the law of Moses by the Hopewell, and that includes the potential sacrifices and burnt offerings in accordance with the law of Moses. There's evidence of altars that are similar to the Joshua's altar that was found. There's evidence of the decommissioning similar to the type of way that was done with the temples outside of Jerusalem, like was done for Joshua's altar and like was done for the Tel Harad site. And so I think that's yet more good evidence for the Book of Mormon. Now, if you have comments or questions, feel free to make them, and I hope you'll like and subscribe. Thanks.